Fantastic. Let me just get this live and make sure that we're actually going live on the right channel, because that would be funny if we weren't. And we are good to go. How fantastic. Okay, so we're here with, well, first of all, let's back up for a second. Hi, everyone. My name's Daniel from Wikitongues, and Okay, I've muted myself on the live stream. This way, one component of linguistic diversity that we often overlook is writing diversity, the diversity of writing systems. And so I'm here today with someone who's very passionate about that, who's going to teach us a little bit about that and show us some writing systems from all over the world. So hello, Tim.
Hey. So thanks so much for inviting me as your inaugural guest on this stream. I will do my level best to get people interested and excited and informed, and as you say, as passionate as I am. I always start out by saying I came into this with no background in linguistics or anthropology, and one of the reasons why I've grown the Endangered Alphabets project is because from the very beginning, I've been asking different questions to everybody else. And the reason why I've been asking different questions is on the wall here behind me, because my approach has been actually to carve pieces of text from endangered writing systems in wood. We'll get to that in just a second. But first, let me talk about the difference between endangered languages and endangered alphabets, or more technically, writing systems. So everybody who follows Wikitongues knows about endangered languages and recognizes what an important issue this is, not only in terms of the world's store of knowledge. So clearly, individual cultures have collective wisdom that has been developed in their particular circumstances in their particular part of the world, over centuries. But also in terms of human rights and social justice. So if an individual language group is forced to negotiate medical issues, legal issues, educational issues through another language that is not their mother tongue, then that means they are right away at a disadvantage. And the fewer people speak a language, then the more marginalized those few people become. So it's not just the complete loss of a minority language that's important, vitally, but even the fact that smaller and smaller numbers of people are actually using it. What Wikitongues is doing in terms of recording language is also really important, because if nobody speaks a language, again, it's not just the content that's lost. It's very hard, even impossible, to reconstruct the infrastructure of that language, how it comes together, how the tenses work, how the syntax works. So obviously what Wikitongues is doing is vital. Endangered Alphabets, though, has received much less attention, and yet is important in an overlapping but different set of ways. So if something is important, unless we're a traditionally oral culture, we write it down. It is a way of gathering the stuff that we think is vital to ourselves as individuals, as families, as communities, and also transmitting it to other people, over distance, sending them messages, etc. It's more than that, though. And this is what I discovered when I began carving these pieces of text, which is a great story, way too long to tell here. And I tell it with lots of humor and detail in my book, Endangered Alphabets, which I highly recommend as a reviewer. It's available on our website at endangeredalphabets.com. So when we think of writing, we often think of it as being simply a means of capturing speech. So it's as if we're just a somebody giving dictation, somebody's taking down, yeah, this is what was said on that time and that day. It turns out that writing is more than that. It's much more than that in terms of an intellectual achievement and an invention. It's much more than that in terms of what writing means to an individual culture that has developed that writing system. And in world headquarters and workshop and gallery of the Endangered Alphabets project, and I'm going to show you some examples of this. When people stop using their traditional alphabet, which, by the way, is never something that happens by accident or choice. It's invariably that another writing system is imposed upon them, or they're given a choice they can't refuse. Often it's the result of military conquest. I tend to say endangered alphabets are the signs of lost kingdoms. Often it's an imposition of cultural imperialism. You are going to do things our way if you want to get ahead within our territories. And again, I'll give you some examples of this. But if I, as a member of my culture, have been writing down everything that's important for 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, and then that alphabet, that writing system stops being used, within 2 generations, that entire cultural record is lost. It's incomprehensible to kids 2 generations down. It's just, oh, that's the old writing. I can't read it. Yeah, that's how we used to do it. And when that happens, those people sense that they came from somewhere, that they were a people of significance, that they have a purpose and a place on the earth, that they belong, is completely undercut. Not to mention the fact that in specific areas, their right to own their land may have been written in a script that is no longer used. They may get pushed off their own land. There's many, many ways in which it's a cultural catastrophe when people cease to use their traditional writing system. And the Endangered Alphabets project is really about language, it's about writing, but it's also about social justice and human rights. And let's face it, that is what the world is all coming to realize very suddenly right now. The importance of respecting and treating each other equally. And so what we're going to see then is ways in which either a traditional writing system falling into disuse is really, really a significant thing. And also why it is that all over the world, especially now, people are starting to create writing systems for their own cultures because they don't have their own. And this becomes a way of asserting the fact that their culture exists, that has value, and it's not simply a minority or not simply an indigenous or a marginalized people who can be ignored. And we'll get to all that in just a minute. Okay, so I'm now going to switch over by the miracles of phone technology to what we call camera 2 in the trade. And I'm going to start showing you things here. So this is my dining table. And so what you can see, I'm just going to turn the phone around. This is the first piece of Endangered Alphabets furniture that I made. This is actually a blessing in Balinese. Please ignore the wire. That's my laptop charger. That has nothing to do with Bali. So this is a blessing that says, bless this food, bless these people, bless the table that brought them together. And I carved that in the top of the table. It looks very nice. I did not realize how significant that was going to turn out to be in terms of understanding writing systems, Balinese and otherwise. And we'll come back to that in just a little while. So now we're going to swing around and start the tour. And what we see here is, this is actually my second exhibition that I did. And what I did was I wrote a short poem, which was, these are our words shaped by our hands, our tools, our history. Lose them and we lose ourselves. And I sent this off to people all around the world, and I said, can you write this in your traditional script? And then I wound up carving them on these panels. So this, for example, what we can see, the Canadian Aboriginal syllabic system, which is also sometimes used for Cree and sometimes for Ojibwe. And I'm just going to do a slow pan over here, because if I talk about everything, it's going to take forever. And in fact, I'm actually doing right now a series of 8 talks, an hour long each, about the endangered alphabets. And even so, there's stuff I'm missing out. So over here, this convenient and highly expensive and sophisticated piece of demonstration equipment known as a chair, what we see here is 2 things. Lying down horizontally is one of the symbols from the Adinkra symbol system in Ghana, which is really, really fascinating. These are symbols that were sort of stamps that were handmade and then used to stamp on clothing for ceremonial purposes. And each of them is not just a design, but it also has a meaning and a history and a tradition. And by putting those symbols together, they made statements about the chieftain or whoever was wearing these ceremonial robes. This particular one is this extraordinary symbol. Adinkra really uses these very interesting symmetries. This is like an S symmetry or a circular symmetry that is supposedly based on the hair design of a famous warrior, and it's named after him, and therefore this symbol stands for courage. And here we have something that's really entirely different, that talks about writing in other ways. So this is a character, again from Balinese. It's called a pamada, and it's a sign of how narrow our own alphabet is and how limited our conception of writing is, that there is no corresponding form for this in the Latin alphabet or the English language at all. This symbol means the text that follows is a sacred text. And so what it's doing is it is, first of all, encouraging the reader to read what follows with a kind of openness of spirit and reverence. This is no ordinary piece of writing. But the other thing that it does is to say, you know, the Balinese recognized that writing is an exchange of ideas and spirit. If I have an idea, that idea is invisible, it's intangible, it is, if you like, an expression of thought or spirit rather than something visible or physical. When we write, we focus our mind, we try and bring out sort of the best of what we have inside ourselves, and we translate it into something that is, in fact, visible and physical, which then in turn has the ability to affect other people and the way they think and the way they behave. That is an extraordinary transaction. And so for the Balinese, traditionally, writing was a spiritual act, so much so that they had specific mantras that were used before opening a book or before starting to write. And so they're a way of reminding ourselves, this is not just a grocery list. This is not just notes that we're jotting down. This is an extraordinary intellectual, spiritual transaction and should be treated as such. So, moving slightly to the right here, what we have here is in Tibetan, which is one of the traditional scripts of the Philippines. And this is a particularly interesting example because this is part of a series that I did called Mother Tongue. So it says Mother Tongue in Tagalog, written in the Babayan script. And it's an example of the beginnings of script revival, because this was written and sent to me by somebody who has been almost single-handedly at the heart of the Babayan revival, first as a tattoo artist, and then as a graffiti artist, and a hip-hop artist, and a clothing designer, and a performance artist. And his name is Christian Calloway, a remarkable guy. And what he does, I carved this one and painted it in his sort of graffiti hip-hop style, is he says, yes, this is a traditional form, but to make it come alive again, rather than have it be something that just we think of as being, in a museum, we need to use it. We need to use it every day for a variety of reasons. And so language and writing are both living things. And here he is bringing this to life in a variety of different ways as an artist. So now we get around to, people say, I'd like to see your workshop. So here's my workshop, AKA my kitchen counter. So first you'll see here, there's, let me turn this around again. This is my workbench. That says do good work in Javanese. So it's a reminder to take my work seriously. And then this, so this is what I'm working on at the moment. This is actually a sand drawing from Vanuatu. So this is what it looks like when it's actually drawn in the sand. It's an extraordinary achievement. It's very complex. And these sand drawings are done by experts. And there's a narrative associated with each one. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to try and do this in wood and try and create a three-dimensional effect that way. So we'll see. That's work in progress. You don't know how it's going to turn out. So now I guess we need to see the, this is my quality controls supervisor. So to be perfectly honest, the bunny does not care about language in the slightest. She's just not there. So I'm going to come over here to, this was one of the very first exhibition I did. This is Mandaic. So the Mandans are a people of great antiquity who certainly lived in the area that we now call Iraq and the surrounding area. And this is their writing system, their alphabet, is one of the most extraordinary in the world. It has, every letter has a secret and mystical meaning. And in order to understand how much writing means to them, you have to understand that they talk about writing in terms of a creation myth, and the letters of the alphabet having grown out from one to the next until they formed a structure to support each other, this indivisible republic of letters. And the alphabet is not linear like ours, A to Z, it's circular. It begins and ends at the same point, and it has 24 letters to correspond to the 24 hours of the day. So it's actually an alphabet that revolves with the earth. Just extraordinary stuff. This, excuse me for those of you who are suffering motion sickness here. So this is Nushu, which is the only writing system that we know of that was created by and used exclusively by women in China. It's not clear if men didn't know they had this writing system or they didn't care, but it was kept very intimately among the women of the community. And in fact, it was used often to express the the kind of the travails and difficulties of being a sort of an inferior gender in a discriminatory society. It's one of the most extraordinary creations in terms of writing. This is part of an exhibition that I am finishing up right now, where every carving says "Thank you all." So this says "Thank you all" in student who just graduated from Columbia University, Chelsea Wu, who is just got really interested in this notion of a tradition of women's writing. So now we're going to wander further around. We'll come to this one here. So this is cool. Yeah. So this is Samaritan, as in the good. Yeah. So the parable of the Good Samaritan is really based on the fact that the Samaritans and the Jews did not get on. And the whole point of the parable is that the man who is beaten by robbers and is lying there, who comes to save him? Who comes to help him? And it's in answer to a question that Jesus gets asked, which is a trick question, which is, you said we should love our neighbor. Who is my neighbor? And of course, this is a trick question because they are hoping that Jesus would say something against the Romans so he could be arrested, or anything controversial, frankly. And so he tells this story of the Samaritan who saves the guy who's been beaten up. And he turns around and he says, who then was this man's neighbor? And that's such an extraordinary notion because it takes that whole geopolitical complexity of the Middle East, where you have a whole history of warring tribes and enmities, and sort of turns it completely around and puts it in a spiritual dimension and says, this man's neighbor is the man who helped him, is the man who demonstrated love. And this script, which is really interesting because, as you'll notice, the letters are not level. We think of writing as, it ought to have like a flat bottom. And you would say, well, why haven't, this is sort of like gnarly and thorny, this script. How come it hasn't been worn smooth over the course of time so it's easier to write? And the answer is, this is what the Samaritans call ancient Hebrew. And in theory then, according to the Bible, this is the handwriting of God. This is the writing on the stone tablets that in the book of Exodus, Moses brings back down from Mount Sinai, which have been written on by the finger of God. And you don't mess with the handwriting of God.
Before we move on, for people who are watching right now, the Samaritan community still exists today. They're a culture that lives primarily in Israel and Palestine, and depending on what part of Israel and Palestine they live in, they variably speak Hebrew or Palestinian Arabic as their vernacular language, their language of daily speech. And in addition to that, they have a liturgical variety of the Hebrew language that's unique to their culture. And this is fantastic. I've actually never seen this script before. Would this be considered a Semitic abjad akin to Hebrew characters or Arabic characters? Yes. Okay.
Yep.
Interesting. And what language is this written in? This is written in classical Hebrew, you said?
No, this is written in Samaritan, which they call ancient Hebrew. So it's different in that when the Israelites were expelled into Babylon, Hebrew then undergoes certain changes.
Right.
And the Samaritans weren't. And so they claim this is the original and authentic version.
So this is effectively a variety of Hebrew with less Aramaic influence. Aramaic being the language of Babylon at the time.
To call it a variety might be an insult to the Samaritans. So I'm not gonna say one way or the other. because this is a very touchy subject. When you combine writing and religion and statehood, which often go together, it's a powerful mixture. I'm just going to move right on from there.
Well, this is a great example of why language is political, and that was a topic that was a little controversial on this channel a couple weeks ago. But this is another very good example of why. So yes, moving on.
And here is another example of language and politics. So this is Tibetan calligraphy. So this and this is in a circular form, and this says graceful kindness, but it says it twice. And so consequently, this has the act of repeating itself. It kind of becomes a mantra simply by being circular and by being repeated. And in some respects, Tibetan is not an endangered alphabet. But of course, since the Chinese takeover of Tibet, they have gradually moved to a point where Tibetan is increasingly being portrayed as something interesting for tourists, but not something that has political autonomy. And Tibetan is being taught less and less in schools. And so Tibetan might, in fact, be a future endangered alphabet. And I'm sure the Chinese would not be happy with me with that analysis at all. So we're going to swing around over here. So hanging up on my door here, this was a gift to me, and I'm sorry that this should actually be horizontal instead of vertical, but because it's hanging on a door. So this is the Amazigh flag. So when the Amazigh, also known as Berber, revival began taking place in the 1960s, the people who were responsible for it, who were sort of exiled in Paris at the time, decided that they needed a flag, because flags and statehood kind of imply that everybody who lives under that flag is the same, and that it's perfectly okay to have a law that says there's one official language that everybody has to speak. And of course, any Wikitongues person knows that that's completely not only untrue, but it's a way of marginalizing minority communities. So when they designed this flag to represent the Amazigh people, who at one point were flourishing from the western part of Egypt all the way to the Canary Islands. So we're talking about an area that is much bigger than any one country. When they made this flag, they put at the heart of it a letter. And as I say, unfortunately, this is facing the wrong way. You should be kind of tilt your head round to the right. And this is the letter Yaz. And so it really speaks to the importance of writing, that in creating this totemic or emblematic image, a flag, they put a letter in the middle of it. And that's because writing in the Amazigh script called Tifana has been found around North Africa. It's 2,000 years and more old. And it really shows that their culture and their civilization predate the Romans and the Arabs and more recently the French. And so it's a reminder. Many of the endangered alphabets have this kind of once and future king quality about them, this sense that this is a reminder of our significance and our right to a place on, on this planet that is not just a subservient place to a colonial authority.
Tim, I just wanted to pause a second. Hadassah Silvestre from Brazil said, Tim, you always say you don't know much, but you do. Thank you again for sharing your knowledge on the internet.
I learned the skill of sounding as if I know more than I do, which is also a terrible thing, because then people send me questions and say, what about this? What about this? And luckily, by now, I know enough other people to pass those questions on to. So the trick is now not knowing something, but knowing somebody else who knows something.
And to all of the people watching right now, I think we have 25 people tuned in. If you have any questions for Tim, please leave them in the comments where the discussion is ongoing, and I will ask him, and he'll do his best to answer. Modestly, of course.
or I will use my other technique, which is if you ask me a question that I don't know how to answer, I'll answer a different question that I do know the answer to. Okay, so this is glagolitic. This is one invented by the Orthodox Church to spread the gospel up through the Balkans and Eastern Europe and ultimately into Russia. And this says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, which is such an extraordinary notion. I feel as if I could spend the rest of my life sort of meditating on what that means. And interestingly enough, the Mandans have similar spiritual observations about the divine nature of the word. And of course, because we use writing all the time, everyone's taught writing all the time as small kids, it becomes a threat rather than something that has, intellectual and spiritual value. And, we use it for making grocery lists. So in a way, by being a dominant culture, we are least able to understand what writing really is all about, because we're only really able to see our own. So I'm going to zoom around the room a little bit more. And
hey, Tim.
I think that this, I'm going to sit. Yeah, go ahead.
Maria Boccieri or Boccieri, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, so please correct me, Maria, if I said it wrong, wants to know if there are any resources to study Mandan that are available online.
Great. So I'm just going to put camera 2 down at this point and return to camera 1. There we go. Woo!
All right, Tim is back.
Right. Even though I'm up here in Vermont, it is unbelievably hot. So if you'll excuse me. Okay, so one of the things that kept happening when I would go out and give exhibitions of my carvings and give talks about.
Before that, just the question about Mandan. Is Mandan?
I'm getting there.
Cool. Sounds great.
Is that people would say, this is fascinating. Where can I learn more about this? And the answer I always had to give was, there really isn't anywhere. And so starting about nearly 2 years ago now, I decided to pull everything that I had found so far together and put it online in the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets, which you can find at endangeredalphabets.net. Okay, so endangeredalphabets.com is our main home website. Endangeredalphabets.net is the Atlas. So if you go to the Atlas and you can either search by going through the alphabets alphabetically, or you can actually go around on the globe and use the Google pin method and click on the pin. You'll find Mandaic, and you'll find some information about it and some examples and some photos and some links. So there's a bunch of stuff there. If that is not enough, then I also, if you want to contact me individually, through the website, then I can put you in touch with a Mandaean graphic designer who does unbelievably beautiful things in Mandaic scripts. And I can also put you in touch with a couple of academics who are real experts in this subject, unlike me. Okay. You got any more questions for me?
Well, I have a question for you, actually.
Yeah, go for it.
I'd love to tease out the difference between writing system and language a little bit more. One time when I was with a Greek friend who was teaching me some of the Greek alphabet, and she had me write out English sentences using the Greek alphabet. And that was a really great way to learn a new writing system, and it helped me realize that while writing systems are culturally specific, they can also be really universal. And when it comes to the Latin alphabet, people know that it can write hundreds and if not thousands of languages because we see it used in so many languages all the time. But there's other smaller writing systems that I think people confuse with the language itself, right? Like here in Brooklyn, you're going to see a lot of Yiddish signs, but your average person that doesn't know the difference between Yiddish and Hebrew will see the Hebrew characters and just think it's Hebrew, right? Or maybe there will be Urdu or a South Asian or Central Asian language written with the Arabic alphabet, and they'll just assume that it's Arabic, right? And there is kind of a distinction there.
Yes, absolutely. And there's also a history. So if you have a script that is used for different languages all over the place, it means one of two things: either a military empire or a successful spread of a religion, or sometimes both. Obviously, in the case of both Christianity and Islam, it was often both. So one of the reasons why I'm so interested in minority writing systems is because they show us the world from such a different perspective in terms of not being global and not being kind of universal. And in particular, they also show us writing from different perspectives. So, for example, about 3 years ago, I decided, you know what? If you want to introduce languages or scripts or both, or reintroduce them or revitalize them, you've got to start with children. And if you start with children, you've got to create games. And so I started trying to create Endangered Alphabet games. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool to have Scrabble, for example, that you can play in non-mainstream writing systems? And what I realized after a while was that Scrabble really does not work for a whole lot of the writing systems in the world because the Latin alphabet is so sloppy. It is so imprecise. So if you have a letter like the letter C in a word going one way and it's pronounced like a hard C, then you can have a word going across that which uses the C as a soft C. And it's actually the inexactitude of the Latin alphabet that makes Scrabble possible. I know because I tried doing Scrabble with other alphabets and wound up with a board that was like 80 squares by 80 squares. And instead of having a little tile tray like this with 7 letters on, you would have to have like 30 letters. The other thing is that goes along with this is that when you look at, let's say, for example, you have a country or a culture that is a Muslim culture, let's say one of the islands in Indonesia, which is predominantly Muslim, for example. So you'll have much of the official writing, especially the liturgical writing, will be in a version of the Arabic script. When you see traditional Indonesian scripts, though, what you see is the whole history of the island, that island, or those islands and their cultures. And so you'll see letters that were a particular shape because traditionally they were written on palm leaf manuscripts or on folded bark books, or incised in bamboo or on bone. And so the whole intellectual tradition and the technological tradition of those cultures comes together in their writing. And you have a sense then of the ancestry. You say, wow, yes, this is how people have been writing in this part of Sumatra for 500 years. And so when you take that away and you say, we're going to use the Latin alphabet now because it's the global alphabet, you take away people's sense of place and of history and of ancestry.
I think that's a really, really good point. There is a linguist named Isabella Zog who has done a lot of research on alphabet shift in Ethiopia, where because the Ge'ez script, which like Arabic and Hebrew alphabets is a Semitic abjad, isn't as efficiently supported by phones as Latin is, a lot of people are starting to switch to Latin script to write their languages, and that actually seems to precipitate language shift, according to her research too. So in other words, they abandon their script, and then a decade later, their alphabet. We have a question for you, Tim. Before I do, I want to point out another example of like a political history of writing systems being changed. Yijun Luo from China, I think, pointed out that the Mongolian language is written in Cyrillic in Mongolia, and in Inner Mongolia, it tends to still be written with the Mongolian alphabet. And of course, that has to do with the history of the Soviet Empire. Now, Gabor Party asks, Dear Tim, is there anything you can tell us about the Rongo-Rongo script of Rapa Nui, or the Easter Islands, as it is called in English?
Yes. Yep. So there was a fantastic thread on this on Twitter about 3 weeks ago. So if you're on Twitter, then I suggest you just go there and do a little hashtag or a word search on that. So there was a great article which then got picked up and retweeted by a friend of mine. And it was about... first of all, as I'm sure you know, the Rongo-Rongo script is a script that has never been deciphered, and there's a series of people who claim to have deciphered it, but what they actually say it means is not consistent and has that kind of Voynich manuscript quality about it. Secondly, we can't ask anybody because the people who created the script have all died or left. You know, that whole Easter Island culture is not there for examination. This article did include quotes from a conversation that somebody who visited the islands shortly after the script was invented and was just being used for the first time. And so we have this unbelievable glimpse of why people write. And this is a huge subject in itself. And I'm going to say some things here that are flat out like controversial. But there's a standard view of writing that it all began because of the need to keep accounts. This all begins, in Mesopotamia. And it all comes down to the fact that when you have the developments of the early city-state, then you need to sort of keep track of transactions. And my answer to that is that may be true, or it may be an example of this is how we think about writing and we're projecting it onto others. Because in fact, if you look at really early writing elsewhere in the world, which as it developed in Mesoamerica or in China, it has completely different sets of purposes. It's very closely allied with magic and religion, and it's a form of representing communication between the material world and the immaterial world. And in the early Rongo-Rongo usage, as it was first being learned and being taught avidly around the island, there's no doubt that it has this sense of sort of magic / spirituality about it and about the way it's being used. And as I say, I think this is a perspective that we are sort of instinctively unable to think of because we don't think of writing in those terms, and also because we think of people who do as being primitive and like way back there. And so there's this whole evolution theory of writing that it begins with pictograms, but then as people become more sophisticated and more conceptual and more able to handle abstract thought, writing gradually turns into abstract symbols that have no pictographic value. And I challenge that idea. I think that first of all, there are places where you see different kinds of writing from these different theoretically evolutionary stages being used side by side. And because we do that, the whole rise of emojis, for example, is because we want to express things in ways that we can't using traditional phonetic abstract symbols. And so we are reintroducing those elements into our writing by sort of broadening the definition of writing. So the growth area in Unicode right now is in emojis. And it's really a sign that there are things that we want to express that we can express more powerfully and immediately by supposedly ideographic or pictographic writing. And so we do. It doesn't mean we're primitive. It doesn't mean we're backward.
Tim, could you clarify what Unicode is?
Yes, sorry. So one of the radical things that's going to happen one day soon is that two people from a small minority community who have their own minority language and their own minority script are going to be able to pick up their phones and text each other in their own script. And the reason why that's radical is because it doesn't have to go through one of the dominant culture writing systems. It's a way of decolonizing communication. So, in order for that to happen, though, you're faced with this difficulty that if you have a minority script and let's say I go to my friend in his village and I say, will you write out something in your writing? Will you write out all the letters, etc.? And then I happen to have another friend in a different village who uses the same language and the same script. And I say, will you please write it out? They're going to be different. They're going to be different in maybe superficial ways, but computers are not good at handling differences. So what that means then is that you have to develop an agreed upon standard of what every character or letter looks like in order to be able to use it in computing. And so the Unicode standard is this extraordinary endeavor to identify standard versions of all the world's writing systems, past and present, and break them down into individual symbols so they can be encoded, and then those symbols can be assigned to, for example, a keyboard or a phone notepad. The reason I say past and present is that not only does this mean that you can decolonize communication so that, my friend Al-Sadiq Sadiq in Sudan can text to other Zagawa people speaking Zagawa using the Berea script, which, up until now is not possible. It also means that if you have a scholar who is studying, let's say, ancient Minoan scripts and wants to write a paper about it, then up until now, the only way of representing those scripts was by photocopying them. So you had these really terrible images that in any case couldn't be interspersed into the text of the article. And so a lot of ancient scripts have also been encoded in Unicode so that as someone is typing along in their article, they can throw in a letter from linear B, or they can throw in a character, for example, a Mayan character or something like that to illustrate the point they're making. So Unicode, obviously the notion of making everything standard is something that makes some people's hair stand on end. It's like how, things are not standard. But on the other hand, it does make communication possible. And it means that once you have a standard letter in, say, Balinese, you can then have a type designer who takes that and exactly, and then develops other fonts that are based on a Unicode standard that can still be used, within digital communication.
Right. Because for better or for worse, digital technology is integrated with human society at this point, and if you can't interact with your device in your language, that adversely impacts the future of your language. And so it's important for something like Unicode to exist so that we can encode our scripts and so that we don't have to shift to Latin or Arabic or Chinese characters or one of the big, or Cyrillic, right? Or one of the big scripts to write our language on our phones.
Exactly.
And so I think it's a tremendous resource.
I heard a fascinating thing just recently for the first time. So I may be pronouncing this incorrectly. As I say, I always know less than I seem to. But I believe that traditional liturgical Arabic is based on a particular calligraphic style called nastaliq. And it is so calligraphic and it is so not breakable down into individual chunks that when printing was first broadly introduced, there was the question, how do you print a newspaper in Arabic, especially a headline where you want it to be in this beautiful, flowing nastaliq sort of calligraphic style? And I apologize if I'm remembering or mispronouncing the word. And so what would happen is that up until remarkably recently, you would have individual scribes who would actually handwrite this on the paper, or they would create engravings or lithographs so that could be stamped as an individual entity. So I love that idea that the value of this particular calligraphy was so great that it had to remain calligraphy. It couldn't actually be broken down into sort of atomized into small units.
So Alphonse Mellenhorst points out that nastaliq as a calligraphic style is still used in Pakistan and India.
Yes, and bless him, that's a beautiful example of how writing is not just writing. The stuff that we think of in this sort of everyday sense, writing is, oh yeah, I'll write this down. The fact that tradition still exists, and of course the fact that there are still calligraphic traditions in Chinese script, in Mongolian, you were mentioning earlier. I'm a huge fan of Mongolian calligraphy. What calligraphy does is it does that business again of forcing us to bring the best of ourselves to the act of writing. It's the opposite of tweeting. It's the opposite of jotting. And so instead of just bringing, so to speak, the fragments of our mind or the very skimming stuff off the top of our mind, it really forces us to bring the best of us to the table. And really, I learned this by doing the carving, because I had never done carving before this. And believe me, when you're carving, you go slowly. And you really have the opportunity to say, I am going to bring this curve to the point where I look at it and I kind of go, yeah, that's right. That is right. And that in itself reinvests value into the art of writing and the act of writing. And interestingly enough, so this obviously is not going to be suitable for people who watch this particular YouTube down the road, but tomorrow, Wednesday the 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, I'm doing a Zoom talk on Endangered Alphabets and the art of writing, where I'm going to look at these and many other issues that have to do with discoveries that I've made by carving letters instead of writing.
Cool. You mentioned that you're doing an entire lecture series right now, a remote lecture series, of course, because we're all still social distancing.
Right.
Where can people keep up with that? How can folks get announcements and the links and all that?
Got it. Yep. Thank you. Yes. So our main website, endangeredalphabets.com, has a couple of tabs that are really important at this stage. One which says how to support us. So you can click on that to make donations to the Endangered Alphabets Project. So almost all of our income comes from individual donations, and we can't survive without them. But there's another tab which says blog. And so there, if you click on that, right now it's the second blog post down. Obviously, it may kind of go further down with the feed, but there is a blog post about, it's called the Endangered Alphabets Open House Presentation Series. And there it lists all of the 8 talks that I'm giving. If they haven't happened yet, it gives the Zoom link, how to register for that talk. If they have happened, then it gives the YouTube link where you can go and see the recorded version of that talk. And thanks for asking that question.
Of course. So does anybody have any final questions for Tim today? It's going to take a few seconds for stuff to come in. So while we do, I want to talk to you about something that I find very, very interesting, which is the concept of quipus in Andean civilization, right? Because historians have not yet been able to agree on what quipus were, whether they were a record-keeping system or whether they were a textile-based form of writing. And the assumption has always been that they're not writing systems because they resemble like these woven necklace braids, and that can't be a writing system. But Andean civilization, the Incan Empire, had tremendous advancements in mathematics and engineering. And it's always seemed a little strange to me to assume that this was an entirely oral culture, right? And it seems a little culturally narrow to assume that these quipus weren't writing systems just because they don't resemble writing systems that we know. And in fact,
Right.
Andean civilization is one of the longest, or has one of the oldest textile traditions in all of human history, right? And so it wouldn't be totally out of left field that their writing system was based in fabrics and not parchment.
I would add another idea, which is that because we have come to see writing as something that is separate from the act of uttering speech, we've lost the belief or lost the thought that writing and performance could actually coexist in the same entity. So one of the things I'm writing a print edition of the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets right now, and one of the things that fascinates me, I've got a whole section called Beyond the Alphabet, and many of those systems are systems in which writing and performance and visual art all come together. And so it's very possible that the knots in the quipu, for example, they could have been part of a recitation process. And so you actually have hand memory, right? As you're running it through your hand, it's actually part of a series of pieces of information that you're saying out loud or chanting or singing. And it would make perfect sense that instead of something which is a visual record, you have something which is a tactile record, but both of them bring together the notion of recording something with performing something.
That is a very, very cool way to think about it.
Just occurred to me.
Yeah, and I suppose there's also a culturally narrow assumption that I'm making that in order to do engineering and mathematics, you need to have a written culture, right? We all, when we try and understand the world, we have our own biases and blind spots. Now, Hadassah Silvestre has one more question for you, and then I think we can
Sure.
wrap up. She says,
Sure.
do you have any students, someone who is trying to learn more from you and what you do?
Ha! Boy, I wrote to Harvard a while ago saying, you know what, I will be your endangered alphabets expert, and we'll set up a center here and blah blah blah. And I don't think I ever heard back from them. So I don't have students, but I do have a research team that's working with me. And in theory, they are interns. In practice, they're already starting to learn more about specific areas than I do. So yeah, I'm going more with the team-based approach, which says pretty soon I'm going to be learning from you rather than vice versa.
So in other words, Tim does have students, but he's too modest to say so.
That implies that they, for example, might have to sit at my feet or pay me or something, which I don't think is a good attitude at all, although heaven knows we need the donations. Yes.
So if someone is interested in joining your team, can they email you?
Yep, they can. So remember, there's two websites. There's the Atlas at endangeredalphabets.net, and then there's the main website at endangeredalphabets.com. Both of them have a contact tab, and you can reach me through either of those.
Fantastic. So one more time, to support the Endangered Alphabets project, you can head over to endangeredalphabets.com, where you'll see how to donate, keep up with Tim's online lecture series, or even join his team.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for tuning in today. If you would like to support Wikitongues, you can do so at patreon.com/Wikitongues. We do our best to post every day about something in the world of language, be it news about language activists who are keeping their languages alive, or something from the history of culture. I want to thank actually two of our newest patrons, Thea Magnuson and Per de la Vega. If you want your own Patreon shout out, you can head over to patreon.com/Wikitongues and support us. And I want to thank everybody who tuned into our very first live stream today. This was so fun. Tim couldn't see in the comments, but we had folks from all over the world saying hello in Herero, which is a language from Namibia, language from Turkey. We had people saying hello in some Celtic languages. We had someone tuning in from Indonesia, staying up super late. So as usual, the Wikitongues audience is global and wonderful, and we appreciate you all very much. As we would say in my ancestral language, Yiddish, dank. Now, on Thursday, we're going to be having another live stream with Ana Luisa Daigneault from the Living Tongues Institute. We're going to be talking about a toolkit that we recently published, which helps you get started keeping your language or your writing system alive. So keep an eye out for an announcement on that on our community feed. And until then, we'll see you around. Now the question, since this is our first live stream, we also don't know how to turn it off. Tim and I actually met last week to practice figuring this out, and interesting.
Well, I thought I could talk for 9 hours about this stuff.
Right, so we could, yeah, I mean, we'll probably have to do another one of these. I think that we just barely began to scratch the surface, and there were some tremendous conversations going on in the comments section about different languages and different writing systems, and maybe we could get Kristen from Wikitongues on here and have two of us, so one person can talk to you and one person can, better include all of our wonderful commenters. So how do I turn this? I really don't know how to turn this off. Everyone's saying thank you. Thank you, guys. We really, really appreciate you. New scene, live.
Just unplug it.
I think we're just going to hang up and see what happens there. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Finish.